The doctors told Serena Chen to say goodbye. Her father lay in the hospital bed, tubes snaking from every part of his body, machines beeping out the final hours of his life. A massive stroke, they said. Catastrophic brain damage. No hope of recovery. But Serena couldn't say goodbye, because her father's eyes were open, and he was trying to speak. Dad, she leaned close, pressing her ear to his lips. Dad, I'm here. What is it? What are you trying to tell me? The words came out broken, shattered, each syllable costing him everything he had left. Blackwell. He. Robert Blackwell? Dad, what about him? What did he do? Her father's hand found hers. His grip was weak, so weak, from a man who had carried her on his shoulders as a child, who had taught her to ride a bike, who had held her when she cried over her first heartbreak. Killed. Me. He. Killed. His eyes went wide. His grip tightened for one impossible moment. Then the machines screamed, and the nurses rushed in, and Serena was pushed against the wall while they tried to restart, a heart that had already given up. She watched them work, watched the paddles, watched her father's body jerk and fall still, watched the nurse check the clock and call the time of death, 11:47 p.m. January 15th, the day before her birthday, she watched her father die with a name on his lips. Robert Blackwell, the man who had just been named CEO of Blackwell Industries, the man her father had worked for, trusted, believed in for 20 years, the man who had murdered him. Subscribe now. Because what Serena does next will take 7 years, destroy an empire, and prove that the dead can still demand justice. The funeral was the cruelest performance Serena had ever witnessed. 300 people came to mourn William Chen. They filled the church with flowers and whispers, dressed in black and hypocrisy, pretending to grieve a man they had already condemned. Because the official story, the story that had spread through the business world before William's body was even cold, painted him as a criminal, a thief, a fraud, a desperate man who had stolen $12 million from Blackwell Industries and suffered a stress-induced cardiac event when confronted with his crimes. The newspapers printed it as fact. The financial channels discussed it as a cautionary tale. William Chen, the man who had climbed from nothing to become CFO of one of America's largest companies, reduced to a punchline about greed and desperation, and the man responsible for it all stood at the pulpit and delivered the eulogy. William was a troubled man, Robert Blackwell said, his voice heavy with manufactured grief. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His charcoal suit cost more than most people earned in a month. His face wore the mask of sorrow that Serena would learn to recognize as his most practiced lie. We tried to help him, Robert continued. We offered rehabilitation, treatment, a chance to make things right and restore his reputation. But in the end, the shame was too much for him. The weight of what he had done was more than his heart could bear. A murmur of sympathy rippled through the church. Serena sat in the front row and listened to her father's murderer describe him as a criminal. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She memorized every word, every pause, every gesture of false compassion, every performance of sorrow from the man who had watched her father die and done nothing to save him. After the service, Robert approached her. The crowd parted for him, they always did. He walked through the mourners like a king through his court, accepting condolences and sympathy, as if he were the one who had suffered a loss. Serena. He took her hand in both of his grip warm and firm and utterly nauseating. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father was complicated, but he was brilliant. We'll miss him terribly. Serena looked into his eyes. She saw nothing. No guilt, no fear, no recognition that he was speaking to the daughter of the man he'd killed. Just the calm, practiced emptiness of a sociopath. She had seen that emptiness before, in crime documentaries, in psychology textbooks, in the faces of men who destroyed lives and slept soundly afterward. Thank you, Mr. Blackwell, she said. That means so much. She pulled her hand away slowly, deliberately, and she began to plan. The first year was hell. The accusations against her father destroyed everything the Chen family had built. His pension, 20 years of contributions, enough to support Grace Chen for the rest of her life, was seized pending investigation. The life insurance company refused to pay, citing ongoing criminal inquiry and material misrepresentation on the application. The house, Serena had grown up in the house, where she had learned to walk, where she had celebrated birthdays and holidays, where her parents had built a life together, was sold to cover legal fees that mounted even after her father's death. Because even dead men can be sued. Even dead men can be dragged through courts. Even dead men can have their reputations destroyed while their families pay the price. Serena moved her mother into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. 2 bedrooms, no sunlight, the kind of place that smelled of mildew and defeat. Grace Chen had loved her husband with the kind of devotion that doesn't survive betrayal. Not the betrayal of his death, she could have handled that. She had prepared herself for that possibility every day of their marriage, the way all wives of ambitious men must prepare. Heart attacks, strokes, the stress of climbing corporate ladders in a world that wanted to push you back down. But the betrayal of his reputation, that was different. The whispers followed her everywhere. The former friends who crossed the street to avoid her, the neighbors who stopped saying hello, the looks of pity, mixed with suspicion, as if embezzlement might be contagious, as if being married to an accused thief made you guilty by association. Grace stopped leaving the apartment in March. She stopped eating in April. Serena would come home from work. She had taken a job at a temp agency, answering phones, invisible and anonymous, and find full plates of food untouched on the counter. Her mother would be sitting by the window, staring at nothing, refusing to speak. "Mom, please. You have to eat something." "What's the point? They've taken everything. Your father's name, our home, our life." Grace's voice was hollow, empty. "They're saying he was a thief, Serena. After everything he sacrificed, everything he built, they're saying he was nothing but a thief." "He wasn't. We know he wasn't." "Do we?" Her mother turned to look at her, and Serena saw something terrible in her eyes, something that had broken beyond repair. "Because sometimes I wonder, sometimes I think, maybe I didn't know him at all. Maybe the man I loved for 30 years was someone else entirely." "Mom, no. Dad told me, before he died. He said Robert Blackwell killed him. He said, he was dying, Serena. People say things when they're dying. They hallucinate. They don't know what's real." Grace turned back to the window. "Maybe it's easier to believe he was murdered than to believe he was a criminal. Maybe I want that to be true because the alternative is too painful." "It is true. I know it is." But her mother wasn't listening anymore. In May, Serena came home from work and found the apartment door unlocked. The bathroom door was closed. Water was running, had been running for hours. From the sound of it, the pipes groaning with the strain. She knew before she opened the door. Knew in the way that daughters always know when the worst has happened. Knew from the silence beneath the rushing water, from the smell of copper in the air, from the terrible certainty that had been building in her chest for months. Grace Chen was in the bathtub. The water was red. A kitchen knife lay on the floor beside her. The note on the counter said only, "I'm sorry. I couldn't live with what they're saying about him. Tell them he was innocent. Tell them I loved him. Tell them I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough." Serena called 911. Then she sat on the bathroom floor, holding her mother's cold hand, and screamed until her voice gave out. She was 23 years old, orphaned, bankrupted, alone. The Blackwells sent flowers to the funeral. White lilies, tasteful, expensive. Serena burned them in the parking lot of the funeral home and watched the ashes scatter in the wind. The investigation into William Chen's alleged embezzlement concluded 6 months after her mother's death. He was found guilty posthumously, $12 million, the report said, siphoned over 3 years through falsified vendor payments. The evidence was overwhelming: bank records, forged signatures, a paper trail that led directly to accounts in his name. The accounts were real, the signatures were real, the transfers were real. William Chen had been framed so thoroughly, so professionally, so completely, that even Serena, who knew in her bones that her father was innocent, couldn't find a single crack in the case. She tried. God, she tried. She spent every night for 18 months reviewing documents. She hired forensic accountants she couldn't afford, maxing out credit cards and taking loans she would never be able to repay. She begged former colleagues to talk to her, people who had worked with her father for decades, who had praised his integrity, who had called him a mentor and a friend. No one would help. The Blackwells were too powerful, too connected, too dangerous. One accountant agreed to look at the documents, then called Serena 3 days later to say he was dropping the case. "I'm sorry," he said. "I have a family. I can't afford to make enemies like this." A former colleague met her for coffee, listened to her evidence, then stood up and walked away without a word. The next day, Serena learned he had been promoted to vice president at Blackwell Industries. One by one, everyone who had known her father found reasons to forget him. His entire legacy was rewritten by people too afraid to tell the truth. By the time Serena turned 25, she had lost everything: her parents, her money, her home, her faith in justice. She was working as a paralegal at a small firm, living in a studio apartment the size of her childhood closet, eating ramen for dinner because groceries were a luxury. She had stopped believing her father would ever be vindicated. She had stopped believing in anything at all. Some nights, she thought about her mother, about the bathtub, about the knife, about how easy it would be to follow her into the dark. She didn't, but she thought about it, and then the letter arrived. The envelope had no return address, no postmark, just her name, handwritten in shaky script, slipped under her door sometime during the night. Serena stared at it for a long time before opening it. In 2 years of investigating, she had learned that hope was dangerous, that every lead turned into a dead end, that the universe had a cruel sense of humor when it came to people like her. But she opened it anyway. Inside was a single page, handwritten on lined paper that trembled with the writer's fear. "I saw what happened to your father. I was there when he died. I've been afraid to come forward for 5 years, but I can't live with it anymore. The guilt is killing me. If you want the truth, the real truth about what Robert Blackwell did, meet me at St. Michael's Church, Thursday at 7 p.m. Come alone. Tell no one. If they find out I'm talking to you, they'll destroy me like they destroyed him. A friend." Serena. It could be a trap. The Blackwells had eyes everywhere. They could have discovered her investigation, decided she was a threat, arranged a meeting to silence her permanently. Or it could be real. Someone who knew, someone who had seen, someone who might be able to prove what she'd known in her heart since the moment her father whispered his murderer's name. She had nothing left to lose. Thursday night, she went to the church. St. Michael's was old and quiet, the kind of church that seemed to exist outside of time. Stone walls, stained glass, the smell of incense and candle wax. Serena arrived early and sat in the back, watching the door. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were shaking. She had a knife in her purse, not because she thought she could fight off attackers, but because she refused to die without trying. At 7:03, an old man shuffled through the door. He was 70 at least, maybe older. White hair, stooped shoulders, hands that trembled as he dipped them in the holy water and crossed himself. He saw Serena and stopped. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Two strangers in an empty church, bound together by a secret that had destroyed one of them and was slowly destroying the other. Then the old man walked to the last pew and sat down beside her. "You're William's daughter," he said. Not a question. "Yes. You look like him. Same eyes. Same way of holding yourself. Like you're ready to fight the whole world." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. He was always ready to fight. That's what got him killed. Serena's heart stopped. "You saw it happen. I heard it, saw the aftermath, was close enough to put the pieces together." He stared at the altar, at the candles flickering in the darkness. "My name is James Morrison. I worked security at Blackwell Industries for 32 years. I was stationed outside Robert Blackwell's office the day your father died. Tell me everything. James was quiet for a long moment. His hands were shaking badly now, not just trembling, but full shakes that made the pew creak beneath him. I was supposed to retire that year, he said finally. 32 years of service, good pension, enough to take care of my wife, leave something for my grandchildren. I had 3 months left. He closed his eyes. Your father came in for what he thought was a routine meeting. Robert had called him personally, said there were some accounting questions, nothing serious, just wanted to go over a few things before the quarterly report. But it wasn't routine. No, Robert was waiting for him. Robert and his son, Marcus. Marcus was there, standing by the window, didn't say a word the whole time, just watched. James's voice dropped to a whisper. Robert accused your father of stealing money, showed him documents, bank records, transfer orders, signatures. Your father said they were forgeries, said he'd never seen those accounts before, said he was being framed. He was telling the truth. I know. James finally looked at her, and she saw tears streaming down his weathered face. I know because I saw Robert plant those documents myself, 3 weeks before the meeting. I walked into your father's office late one night. I was doing rounds, thought the light was a malfunction and found Robert at your father's desk. He had files spread everywhere. He was practicing signatures, copying your father's handwriting onto papers. Serena felt the world shift beneath her. Proof, real proof. Why didn't you say anything? Because I'm a coward. The words came out like a confession, like something he'd been holding inside for 5 years, rotting in his chest. Because I have a daughter and grandchildren and Robert Blackwell could destroy them without breaking a sweat. Because I told myself it wasn't my business, that I didn't really know what I saw, that it would all work out somehow. He grabbed her hand. It didn't work out. Your father confronted Robert with the truth, said he had evidence of his own proof that Robert had been committing securities fraud for years, said he was going to the SEC, said he'd rather go to prison for whistleblowing than let Robert destroy the company they'd both spent their lives building. What happened? Robert laughed, said no one would believe a thief, said your father's reputation was already destroyed. Your father tried to leave. Robert grabbed him. There was a struggle. James's voice broke. Your father fell, hit his head on the corner of Robert's desk. I heard the sound through the door. That crack. I'll never forget that sound as long as I live. Serena's vision blurred with tears. Robert just stood there, James continued, watching your father seize on the floor. Marcus was screaming at his father to call an ambulance. He's dying, Dad. Call 911. We have to help him. But Robert said, not yet. We need to make sure the story is straight. They let him die. They let him die. James was sobbing now. By the time they called the paramedics, it was too late. And I just stood there. I heard everything and I did nothing. For 5 years, I've carried that. And I can't anymore. Serena sat in the darkness of the church, holding the hand of the man who had watched her father die. She should have felt rage, hatred, the burning need for immediate vengeance. Instead, she felt something colder, clearer, purpose. James, I need you to testify. I can't. They'll destroy me. My family. They've already destroyed everything I love. Serena's voice was steel. My father, my mother, my entire family. Robert Blackwell took everything from me because my father tried to do the right thing. She squeezed his hand. You've been carrying this for 5 years. You came to me because you want to be free of it. The only way out is through. James stared at her for a long moment. They'll kill me, or ruin me, or both. Maybe. But you're already dying, aren't you? Slowly, from the inside, from the weight of what you didn't do. He flinched like she'd struck him. I know because I felt it too, Serena continued. The guilt, the shame, the wondering if you could have done something different, something better, something that would have changed everything. It eats you alive. It never stops. She leaned closer. But this can stop it. Telling the truth, facing what happened, making sure that my father's death meant something. James was quiet for a very long time. Then, "What do you need me to do?" The investigation took 3 years. Serena couldn't go to the police. The Blackwells had donated millions to police foundations, had commissioners and captains on speed dial, had the kind of influence that made investigations disappear. She couldn't go to the SEC. Robert had connections there too. Former colleagues, old friends, people who owed him favors and feared his wrath. She needed to build a case so airtight, so overwhelming, so impossible to ignore that no amount of money or influence could make it disappear. She started with James's testimony, recorded it, documented it, had him write out everything he remembered in excruciating detail, the dates, the times, the exact words he had heard through Robert's office door. Then she went hunting for more. The securities fraud her father had discovered, the real crime Robert was trying to hide. When he framed William Chen hadn't stopped with her father's death. It had continued, grown, metastasized through every level of Blackwell Industries. Serena found it. Not through marriage, not through infiltration, through pure, relentless investigation. She tracked down former employees who had been fired for asking too many questions. She found accountants who had noticed irregularities and been paid to look the other way. She cultivated sources inside the company, people who hated Robert, people who feared him, people who were waiting for someone brave enough to take him down. She built her case piece by piece, document by document, testimony by testimony. She worked 18-hour days. She learned forensic accounting. She taught herself corporate law. She became an expert in securities fraud, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. And slowly, the picture came together. Falsified earnings reports going back 15 years, bribes to foreign officials, suppression of product safety data that had led to deaths, a pattern of corruption so vast that even Serena, who had suspected the worst, was staggered by the scope of it. Her father had died to expose this. Now she would finish what he started. Marcus Blackwell found her by accident. She was 30 years old, working as a forensic accountant at a firm that specialized in corporate fraud. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had become an expert in catching the kind of criminal who had destroyed her family. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the receptionist buzzed her office. "There's a man here to see you, Marcus Blackwell. He says he doesn't have an appointment, but it's urgent." Serena's blood went cold. Marcus Blackwell, Robert's son, the heir who had stood by the window while her father died. The man who had screamed for an ambulance and been told to wait. She should have refused. Should have reported the conflict of interest. Should have done anything except sit across from the man whose family had destroyed hers. Instead, she said, "Send him in." The man who walked through her door was not what she expected. He was tall, dark-haired, handsome in a haunted, hollow way. But his eyes were the eyes of someone who hadn't slept in years, someone who carried a weight so heavy it was crushing him from the inside. "Miss Chen?" He didn't sit down, just stood in front of her desk, hands shaking slightly, looking at her like she might save him or destroy him, and he wasn't sure which he wanted. "Yes. My name is Marcus Blackwell. I need help with." He stopped, swallowed. "I think my father is a criminal. I think he's been committing fraud for years, and I think he killed someone to cover it up." Serena felt her heart stop. Killed someone? 7 years ago. A man named William Chen. He was the CFO. Everyone said he stole money and died of a stroke. But I was there. I saw what really happened. I saw my father. His voice broke. "I've been trying to forget for 7 years. Trying to convince myself that I imagined it, that I was wrong, that my father isn't a monster, but I can't. I can't forget, and I can't live with it anymore." He looked at her with desperate, haunted eyes. "I heard you're the best at uncovering corporate fraud. I need you to help me prove what my father did. I need you to help me destroy him." Serena stared at the man who was asking her to do what she'd been planning for 3 years. He didn't know who she was, didn't recognize the name Chen, didn't realize that the woman sitting across from him was the daughter of the man he'd watched die. She could tell him, could reveal herself right now, could watch the horror dawn on his face as he understood what he was really asking. Instead, she said. "Sit down, Mr. Blackwell. Tell me everything." The investigation accelerated after Marcus joined it. He had access Serena could never have obtained on her own. Documents, testimony, the inside knowledge of someone who had grown up watching Robert Blackwell operate. And he had guilt. Crushing, consuming guilt that drove him to work as hard as Serena did, to sacrifice as much as she sacrificed, to burn with the same desperate need for justice. They worked together for 6 months before she told him the truth. It was late. They were in her office, surrounded by evidence, exhausted and exhilarated by a breakthrough in the case. Marcus was talking about his father, about the moment he'd known something was wrong, about the years of silence that had eaten him alive. "I should have said something," he said. "When it happened, when I saw him fall, I should have called the ambulance myself. I should have told someone. I was 22 years old, and I was so afraid of my father that I let a man die." "You were a kid." "I was old enough to know better." Marcus buried his face in his hands. "William Chen had a family, a wife, a daughter. I took everything from them because I was too much of a coward to speak." Serena was quiet for a long moment. "I know about the daughter." Marcus looked up. "You do?" "I know a lot about her." Serena took a breath. "I know that after her father died, her mother killed herself. I know that she spent years trying to prove his innocence and failing. I know that she lost everything, her home, her money, her faith in justice. I know that she thought about giving up, about following her mother into the dark." Marcus's face was pale. "How do you know all that?" Serena met his eyes. "Because William Chen was my father. And I'm the daughter whose life you destroyed." The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus stared at her. His face cycled through shock, horror, recognition, and finally a grief so profound it seemed to age him 10 years in 10 seconds. You're Serena Chen." "Yes, you've been working with me for 6 months, helping me investigate my own father, and you're the daughter of the man he killed, the woman who's been building this case for 3 years, the person who's going to make sure Robert Blackwell pays for what he did." Marcus stood abruptly. His chair crashed to the floor behind him. "Why didn't you tell me? Would you have helped me if I had?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know what I would have done, but you should have told me. You should have given me the choice." "You're right." Serena stood to face him. "I should have, but I was afraid. Afraid that you would run. Afraid that you would warn your father. Afraid that I would lose the only ally I've ever had in this fight. I wouldn't have." "I know that now. I didn't know it then." She took a step toward him. "Marcus, I've spent 7 years alone. 7 years fighting an enemy with unlimited resources and no conscience. 7 years watching everyone I approach get threatened or bribed or silenced." Her voice cracked. "When you walked into my office, I thought it was a trap. I thought your father had finally found me and sent you to destroy me. It took months before I believed you were real, before I believed that anyone from your family could want justice." Marcus was crying now, silent tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what my father did, for what I didn't do, for all of it. I know. How can you even look at me? How can you stand to be in the same room with me?" Serena considered the question. "Because you're not your father. Because you've spent 7 years carrying the same guilt I've carried. Because you came to me wanting to make things right, even though you didn't know who I was." She reached out and took his hand. "And because I've learned that revenge isn't enough. Destroying Robert Blackwell won't bring my father back. It won't bring my mother back. It won't give me back the 7 years I've lost." She squeezed his hand. "But justice might give me something else. A future. A chance to stop being defined by what he took from me." Marcus looked at their joined hands. At the woman who should have been his enemy. At the daughter of the man his father had killed. "What do you need me to do?" "What you've been doing. Help me finish this. Help me bring him down." "And after?" Serena was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I haven't thought about after. I've been so focused on revenge for so long. I don't know who I am without it. Maybe we can figure that out together. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was a start. The trial lasted 4 months. Robert Blackwell was charged with securities fraud, obstruction of justice, bribery, and thanks to James Morrison's testimony, involuntary manslaughter in the death of William Chen. The murder charge didn't stick. The prosecutors pushed for it, but proving intent was too difficult. Robert's lawyers argued that the death was accidental, that their client had been defending himself, that there was no evidence he had deliberately withheld medical care. But the manslaughter charge held, and the fraud charges decades of falsified earnings, bribes to officials, suppression of evidence that had led to patient deaths. Those added up to something far worse than any single murder charge could have. Robert Blackwell was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. He was 67 years old. He would die behind bars. The day of the sentencing, Serena stood outside the courthouse and watched Robert Blackwell being led away in handcuffs. He saw her. For one moment, their eyes met across the crowd, and she saw recognition dawn on his face. The girl from the funeral, William Chen's daughter, the nobody he had dismissed and forgotten, the woman who had destroyed him. "Who are you?" he called out, loud enough for the cameras to hear. Serena smiled. "I'm William Chen's daughter. My father says hello." Robert's face contorted with rage and fear and something that might have been respect. Then the marshals pushed him into the van, and he was gone. 1 year after the trial, Serena Chen married Marcus Blackwell. Not in a church, not with a crowd. Just the two of them, a justice of the peace, and James Morrison as their witness. "This is insane," her friends said. The few friends she had made in the years of investigation, the people who had helped her along the way. "He's a Blackwell. His family destroyed yours." "His father destroyed mine," Serena corrected. "Marcus helped me get justice. There's a difference." It wasn't a fairy tale. They both carried scars that would never fully heal. She had nightmares about her father's final words, about her mother's body in the bathtub, about the years of fighting alone in the dark. He had nightmares about the sound of a body hitting a desk, about his father's cold voice saying, "Not yet," about the 22-year-old who had been too afraid to save a dying man. But they carried those scars together, and somehow that made them bearable. 5 years after the trial, Serena stood in front of a building with her father's name on it, the William Chen Center for Corporate Ethics, a research institute dedicated to exposing fraud, protecting whistleblowers, and ensuring that what happened to her father would never happen to anyone else. Marcus stood beside her, their 3-year-old daughter balanced on his hip. Little Grace, named for the grandmother she would never meet. "Your grandfather would be proud," Marcus told the little girl. "He was the bravest man I never really knew. He died trying to do the right thing." Serena squeezed his hand. Her father was gone. Her mother was gone. 7 years of her life had been consumed by grief and rage and the relentless pursuit of justice. But she had won. Not through deception, not through infiltration, through the simple, brutal, exhausting work of finding the truth and refusing to let it be buried. "Dad," she whispered, looking up at his name carved in stone. "I kept my promise. I told them you were innocent. I made them pay for what they did." The wind stirred the leaves around her feet. And somewhere, she was certain, William Chen was finally at peace. If this story proved that the dead can still demand justice, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tell me in the comments. What moment destroyed you? The hospital bed? The bathtub? The letter under the door? The courtroom confession? Justice doesn't have an expiration date. See you in the next story.